Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor, and as you can probably tell, I'm a little bit sick right now. But that doesn't mean today's episode is not amazing. Scott Van Camp is a licensed family and marriage therapist, and he's a man of many layers. He's covered in tattoos, and he's a former competitive fighter and touring punk musician, all while being a mental health professional for the last 33 years. During our conversation, Scott talks about growing up in a broken home in upstate New York, working in the same correctional system that housed Mike Tyson in the 1980s, living in some of the worst gang neighborhoods in Hawaii, and how he cultivates humility, healthy anger, and the warrior poet ethos without sacrificing his masculinity. Scott is a fascinating guy with an astonishing life story, and I'm incredibly grateful that I had the opportunity to sit down with him. There's so much food for thought in this episode, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Scott Van Camp. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here.
I like to start off every episode with gratitude, and in this particular case, I am grateful for two things. So the first is that you are a therapist who works a lot with men's issues.
Correct.
And I think that that is something that we have not paid a lot of attention to historically. And I'm glad that people are now more aware of that and are starting to work through that. But then also the other thing that I am grateful for is you, like myself, are somebody who has been around fighting and fight gyms for a very long time. And I think that that is a very unique part of the human experience and the male experience. And I am sure that that has informed a lot of your work and your opinions in therapy and also in life.
Yeah, definitely. That warrior archetype.
Yeah, so I'm grateful that you can bring that experience into both your work and also this interview.
Yes. Thank you, David. Yeah.
So the place I wanted to start was, where did you grow up?
I grew up in upstate New York, technically Western New York, Rochester.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how would you describe your childhood?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. How long is the podcast?
As long as you want it to be.
It was interesting. Family-wise, it was pretty idyllic until the age of 11. And, I say family-wise because I grew up in a place where there wasn't a lot of kids. It's mostly it was an older Italian neighborhood
Okay.
in New York. And so, I had a hard time, kindergarten, first grade. I just kind of racially, it was difficult for me in the school that I was in. I had some bullying experiences, some pretty gnarly bullying experiences,
Yeah.
and including a teacher in first grade who was physical with me a few times. And but home was great until 11, and then at 11, things pretty much fell apart. A lot of fighting in our home,
Yeah.
and we moved, and I moved away from friends, and had a difficult time kind of fitting in where we moved. And it was really interesting because I went from, kind of getting those labels of like gifted and talented academically to, experiencing what now hopefully would be identified as, depression and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Right.
But then, I went from those labels, gifted and talented, to, lazy and oppositional. And, that was something that really motivated me to, do my work as a therapist also,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see a direct line there between the chaos at home and you starting to exhibit those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the socialization piece with peers was difficult. And, I think the academic success sort of mitigated that.
Yeah.
And, when the academic success was overshadowed by, just not really having the energy, not sleeping very well. I probably had anxiety also. It's
Right.
anxiety, depression, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And I was anticipating like the fighting that would go on in the house, and all the noise, and just the chaos, and just literally shut down. And I think the only teachers that really approached me about things, would ask me like what substance I was using, or
Oh, interesting.
things that were more judgments than offerings of support.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, that was unfortunate. It was.
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine between the bullying and the physical abuse in school, but then also the violence at home, that it must have been very hard to feel any sort of sanctuary.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, growing up, my dad, you and I talked about this, like, off mic a little bit. My dad basically had two speeds, and I'm sure that's probably been tempered, although I don't have much contact with him. But he was either remarkably charismatic, like, when friends would come over, or, his friends, or he was angry.
Yeah.
That's the two options that we had to choose from.
Yeah.
So, that leads to hypervigilance, and, it leads to kind of, you were talking about men's issues, living in the shadow of your father, and kind of hiding in those shadows out of fear, rather than being able to kind of claim your masculinity in a developmentally appropriate way, with a mentor rather
Right.
than an adversary. Yeah, I mean, I really see where, looking at his history, he did his best. And I also see the repercussions, in my life. And, and those continue. Like, I think the fear was that, if I were myself, I would be rejected or abandoned. And, ultimately that's what happened.
Yeah.
And, my mom, yeah, that's kind of textbook too, in terms of like the impact on her, and that she suffered from really significant depression also. And that got worse until, we lived alone together. And, it got to the point where, she was amazing because, she definitely really loved me unconditionally. And at the same time, the depression was pretty profound. So, it got to the point where she would go to work, and then she would come home, and she would just lay on the couch, like face to the wall,
Yeah.
and cry. And, when she wasn't doing that, she was at the dining room table, chain smoking, and writing these really long letters about, how basically, I ruined her life, and my father ruined her
Uh,
life. And they were several pages long, and they were, several days a week that I would get them in the morning. So there was a lot of fear in the morning,
yeah.
going to that dining room, and seeing what I was going to find. Because those, the words in a lot of ways to me hurt more than, physical abuse would have. Uh, but, yeah, so that was a big part of it. And, I want to say too, is later with my mom, things were really reconciled in a lot of ways. And, I do really credit her for being extremely strong in the context of what she navigated in her
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like a lot of that stuff was her way of coping.
Yeah, I think so. It's really hard to, separate out like what happened,
Absolutely. Yeah.
the etiology of the whole thing. Yeah, I still, I look at the more recent experiences with them. My mom passed almost 4 years ago, but my dad's still around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to switch gears a little bit, when did you start martial arts?
Yeah, that was great. Like, incurring the bullying, the students in kindergarten and first grade were students that had immigrated, and they were much older. They was almost 3 years older, and that's quite a bit at that age.
Yeah.
So, that was a daily experience. And I think, right after that, they switched the school districts in New York, and I went to a different school. And I started doing judo in
Yeah.
a like kind of a local recreation. And I stayed with that for, man, I don't know, probably 7 years or 8 years in my childhood.
Yeah.
And got to brown belt in that, and really enjoyed it. And went to the Junior Olympics for judo,
Wow.
which was really fun.
What was that path to getting there?
Was getting my brown belt and doing some local tournaments, and you know the teachers that we had were really supportive. So that was a big influence too. I don't know if I would have pursued that level of competition without instructors that were, so supportive and really believed in the students.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you do any other martial arts during childhood?
Yeah, childhood I kind of visited Ishinryu.
Yeah.
And
Well, actually, maybe explain what that is for people who might not be familiar with it.
yeah, it's I'm going to say it in the Western way, karate.
Yeah.
And I was really disillusioned with that because having incurred the violence that I incurred from a very young age, and then some of that continuing in different contexts, like when in karate they would tell you that this is a 5-point strike, or this is a lethal strike, or something like that.
Yeah.
Already at a young age, I was like, that's not true, and that's a scary misrepresentation of what self-defense really means.
Right.
So yeah, I became disillusioned with that, and later got into boxing and Muay Thai kickboxing, and then some jiu-jitsu, although I'm sure we'll get into this, but some physical limitations really created some barriers for me with jiu-jitsu.
Right. So the karate stuff, was that in the 80s?
Yeah, Cobra Kai came to mind when you said that.
So yeah,
it was like
that's
that.
actually where I was going, because I was out of the country 2 weeks ago, and on the plane they had Karate Kid, and I loved that movie as a child, and I watched it on the plane.
Yeah.
And to go back and look at it now, and the kind of idealization of karate, and like it is all like these death strikes, and
Right.
ending fights with one strike, and all of this stuff, and it looks insane now, but this was really the culture of the time, of pre MMA.
Yeah, and a lot of movements that just don't really have their place in actual combat.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like that, and it was like that too, if we're using the Cobra Kai analogy, in that I experienced like that cult of personality kind of thing,
Yeah.
in terms of the leadership, or the sensei being, this kind of idol.
Yeah.
And I didn't buy into that either. I was, at that point, a little bit rebellious, and thankfully, I think that was a form of resiliency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you had said off mic that you have been practicing as a therapist for a very long time.
Yeah. 33 years. So, like we talked about, I started when I was 3 years old, which was
right.
it's not true. It's so not true.
Yeah. I mean, probably figuratively in a way it is.
Maybe, yeah. There's probably some relevance to that, but no, that's what I've done all my life, in some capacity.
And what was your path towards becoming a therapist, or what made you want to be a therapist?
Oh man, like right after high school, had some spinal issues, and ended up with a spinal fusion, and
that was from fighting?
No, but much worse than Cobra Kai is, how barbaric, the process of a spinal fusion was back then.
Right.
Literally, they pretty much cut me in half, and spent almost 2 years in different forms of body casts.
Wow.
And that was at a time where, just getting out of high school, where people were really starting to find themselves, and again, another really important like social milestone that was missed for me, or was really very much impacted. So yeah, I mean, I think I was just fresh out of the body cast when I started volunteering at a place called Industry State School, which was the New York State Division for Youth, which is famous for being Mike Tyson's home for a few years.
Yeah.
In his childhood. Yeah, and it was very formative also, in that back then in the the late 80s, it was pretty violent to work in a correctional facility, and I think even more so in that there was the power differential of adults working with youths, although many of those youths were extremely street smart and pretty large. They'd been inside and working out for a long time,
Right.
Um, but yeah, and again, that kind of first experiences with mental health slash corrections, and again, that idea of like cult of personality. I think, with those types of organizations, there's not, or at least there wasn't a whole lot of accountability, like there is in like for profit,
Yeah.
because you're either making a profit or you're not. So there wasn't a lot of accountability as far as whether there was a clinical approach to, those kids or not. And, you know, I took to them. Somehow I had boundaries enough to still be safe, although I was like a year older than some of them
Yeah.
were. And, you know, really had a good experience, you know. And again, I saw some things as far as like staff abuse and things like that that were, ended up being really formative in the direction I went with my career because, I just wanted to do everything I could to advocate that, people that needed help weren't abused in the process.
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned the lack of accountability. I don't know if you have any kind of insight being out of that world for so long, but do you think that that has changed at all?
Uh, I've kind of been in and out of that world in some ways. You know, I worked in the adult prison system uh, some fairly recently, and it definitely hasn't changed there very much. I worked in my internship after my master's degree with probation in a program that was supposed to kind of bring therapy to
Yeah.
probation. And it was really interesting because I was very involved with fighting at the time. And yet the probation officers really had a stigma about the therapists. So when we first came in, like we got a lot of hassles for that. And I think it did help me that, I'm kind of covered in tattoos and I was really into fighting and stuff like that. But it was unfortunate that there was that divide.
Yeah.
There didn't need to be, and kids pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, talking about mental health or therapy in that setting, obviously the field has changed a lot in that time frame, but what resources were available to inmates at the time?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting you asked that question. The cottage that I worked at was supposed to be the one for what they were calling at that time like emotionally disturbed inmates. Um, and so we had a social worker, and the other cottages did not. I think there was maybe four other ones on the facility. Um, and it definitely wasn't ideal in terms of the therapeutic relationships and the boundaries.
Yeah.
The boundaries was probably the biggest concern. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at that point in your life, what kind of like training or tools did you have for that environment?
Yeah. Yeah. That's another great question. And this speaks to the resources that they had, in that um, I was one of the youngest hires for the New York State Division for Youth, after volunteering. And, at that point, this was a long time ago, so hopefully it's changed dramatically. But, um, I we didn't really receive very much training, and I didn't really have education at that point. And like I said, though, working with those kids and seeing the state and the mental health needs was an incredible catalyst, to go to school,
Yeah.
despite those, uh, not so great academic experiences earlier, and just very highly motivated in school at that point. I went to school, voraciously, at least 15 credits per semester. And at the same time, I was working full time at,
Wow.
either industry state school or, later I worked for, during the deinstitutionalization of New York, kids moving from like kind of asylum, type environments to group homes. Worked in one of those early group homes, and
Right.
and there we had more training. And I was, obviously I was going to school at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of my previous guests, and then I've also had this conversation with several other people who have worked in
maybe not as an extreme an environment as that, but definitely a similar type institution or uh, home where kids are suffering generally severe behavioral issues. And
Yeah.
a lot of the stories are very similar to that, of like kind of being thrown into the deep end with very little training or resources. And then also like that is a very heavy line of work, and there
Hmm.
not really being any sort of resources available to the people working there either. Like that they're the kind of guidance is to just self-soothe and kind of like take care of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, I realized at that time that was my first experience, and that's going back the full 33 years, that my first experience with kind of, the limitations of your partner being able to support you, empathically understanding like what your day was like,
Yeah, absolutely.
The woman that I was dating at the time was like, into accounting. So, my day might have consisted of, some physical restraints and some really difficult like emotional interactions with the kids. And, her day was very different. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that was tough. And that's kind of remained a challenge,
Yeah.
that idea of like self-care is really integral part of uh, success and effectiveness as a therapist, or working in those environments also.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such an intense line of work that you know there seems like there needs to be a release valve, because
Yeah,
that pressure just builds otherwise.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I can definitely say that I don't think there's many things that I haven't seen, you know,
Yeah.
in the 33 years. I mean, not only group homes, but like uh, it's like a suicide response team in Hawaii that I worked with. And I worked with programs with, uh, a lot of indigenous kids coming out of locked facilities in Hawaii and trying to, reintegrate them into the community. And um, I just seen a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So I mean that does seem like a good segue, because if I'm correct, Hawaii was the next chapter of that story, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was. It was really interesting because, like I said, going to school full time, working full time, and I was really motivated to help people. Like, when you find what you lose yourself in, you're not lost anymore, kind of thing. And
I like that.
yeah, so I applied for a couple different scholarships academically through Phi Theta Kappa, and I ended up choosing between Cornell and Hawaii. And it's funny because, yeah, being as white trash as I am, like I couldn't picture myself in Cornell in an Ivy League school,
Right. Yeah.
which is is sad now. I wish I would have had the self confidence that I could have gone and thrived there, because I think I could have. Um, and Hawaii was a very interesting experience. And I think one of the things that was really a pillar in that decision was the opportunity to be a minority. You
Yeah.
know, yeah.
So choosing Hawaii was more so about not Cornell than anything that was, well, outside of the minority thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing was we had visited Hawaii, and I've been really fascinated by the places that were away from the the touristy areas, and how the people lived and what their lives were like. And uh, that was a really big motivator also.
Yeah.
And I think also, um, looking at my family of origin experiences, like you can't get too much further away than Hawaii from
Right.
upstate New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I was really embraced. I ended up living in one of the most violent neighborhoods in Hawaii, uh, by Farrington High School. And it was Pinoy boys and Sons of Samoa gangs, and they were very active at that time. And I remember walking my dog and seeing gang members out on their porch. And you know uh, one day one of them finally, like, calling out to me, and I thought, oh man, here we go.
You're right. You're gearing up.
Yeah, I thought there was going to be a problem. And they ended up handing me a 40 ouncer, and I really didn't want to drink it. you know, um, just the timing wasn't right to have a beer at that time. But I drank it with them, and ended up to be situations where when there was gang issues in the neighborhood, they would send someone over to my front door to make sure that I was safe from what was happening.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, really good people. Very different lifestyle, and it's not too difficult to find the good.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. What was the culture like around mental health in Hawaii at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, there was a lot of stigma. I think as there can be, because I think that mental health, especially the field of psychology, was very much dominated by probably white males
Yeah.
in terms of the development of the orientations, and probably a lot of the people that were represented as mental health professionals on the island. So that made it difficult. But as far as resources, uh, there were some. I worked for one program there that was really quite amazing. We actually it was a group home, and while I worked for them, they purchased a 3-mast schooner. Like, yeah, and they made it a group home,
Whoa.
and they would take the kids out, and it was one of the first experiential programs at that level that I was familiar with. And even our part of the program, though, it was based in Kaneohe Bay, and we would build these little 9-foot peanut shell pram boats with the kids,
Yeah.
So rolling our sleeves up and pounding nails with them, and then we would teach them to sail in the bay, and it's great for building trust and not taking yourself too seriously, and
Yeah. Had you any experience with sailing before that?
No, and I still definitely would not consider myself an expert sailor
Yeah.
by any means, But we had a master boat builder, and we had several people that were, really very skilled in sailing. And
Yeah, I mean that must have been such a productive experience for the kids to kind of like work on something in a group
yeah,
and have something to show for it and then actually get to use it.
yeah, it really was. And my role was to kind of bridge the clinical or the therapeutic with the experiential, which in that case was, boat building.
Yeah. Had you graduated at this point?
I graduated with my bachelor's at that point. Um, yeah, yeah, that's where I was at.
So, were you practicing at that point, or is there additional credentials needed?
I wasn't in private practice at that time. Um, I would need a master's degree. In my case, I'm an LMFT,
Yeah.
and then you have to take the exams and get your 3,000 hours, and and then collecting kind of strategic specialties after that for the populations that you most prefer working with.
Right. And then after Hawaii, California was next, right?
California was next, and just looking at the graduate opportunities, and I think in some ways just Hawaii started to feel like a vacation that I was trapped in.
Yeah.
In that I loved working with people, and still the extent to which tourism kind of runs the island. Um, I didn't really prefer that at that time, so I came to California and I did my master's degree there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in the way you describe it, it makes me think a lot of Vegas, which is a place that I have spent a lot of time in due to my days as a professional gambler. But yeah, I mean, the transitory nature and people either being on vacation or being there to escape something, and it being very hard for the locals. It sounds like there's a lot of overlaps.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant comparison in that I get that same visceral feeling in Vegas.
Yeah.
I couldn't spend an extended amount of time in Vegas.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays I feel very much the same way. Like it was a very different chapter of my life for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So you are going to school in California. What did that look like for you?
Same thing, like school full time and work full time, and working with predominantly adolescents still at that point. Um, like again with you would call like severely emotionally disturbed, or they had levels for the group homes at that time,
Right.
and that were indicative of the degree of psychiatric care that was, reportedly needed for the kids. And I worked in locked facilities, which is level 14. So,
What does that mean exactly?
it's the highest level of psychiatric care that can be given. It formerly was. I don't think they use those designations anymore, but which means the doors were locked, and basically it's kind of an institution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at this point, it seems like you had quite a number of years of working either with kids or in a kind of institutional environment. Did you think at that point that that was what you wanted to focus on?
Yeah. I I had done it for many years, and I was open to see what other populations I might be able to work with. Um, and I knew I enjoyed working with adolescents. I mean, it's such a extreme time in life,
Yeah.
in so many ways, and there's so much earnestness and genuineness in adolescence, and for men, I think it's kind of like and maybe this is formally. I'm hoping it was kind of like the last bastion of connection with your emotional self, um, and emotional expression before manhood, when it was expected that we would be more stoic and
Right.
yeah, and you know really kind of dissociated from our emotions.
Yeah, because I mean, time frame wise, that was probably mid to late 90s.
Coming back, yeah, it was late 90s at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. I mean, I think culturally things have changed somewhat, but I think that sentiment is still very prevalent today.
I think that would probably be safe to say.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of confusion around things, in terms of, you know, masculine and feminine, and, like, yeah, just like what it means to embrace, like you mentioned, things like fighting, and at the same time, like being an emotionally aware person that, can express your emotions in real time among other men, and, is not afraid to, hug your friends. And, you know, I think things are, definitely changing in a way that is much more positive.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I think when I think of fighting, I think of sports like ultra marathons, things like that, and those are ways to really test yourself and really find yourself. And fighting to me is the ultimate form of that. And it is a situation where you are in a ring or in a cage with one other person, and that person is trying to hurt you, and it's hurt or be hurt. And obviously fighting is open to all, but for me it is a very unique part of the masculine experience. And it I think it connects to or embraces a lot of different parts of that experience in terms of controlling your emotions, owning your anger, being talented or showing aptitude at something, or being effective.
Sure.
And we've both been around fight gyms for a very long time, and like there are definitely negative aspects to that, but there are also a lot of positive aspects which are maybe still a little taboo in our society today.
Yeah, I think the idea of being male is just as much important. The feminine is the masculine.
Yeah.
I saw your Joseph Campbell book over there.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that, and just there's that warrior archetype, which I think is really meaningful, and is very masculine, and doesn't need to be toxically masculine.
Yeah.
I think that's been something that you and I have both worked on reconciling in our lives. And then there's the poet side of being man or being a person in the world, and that would be much more, I would imagine, what people would equate with the feminine, and just being able to be that poet warrior, and to be comfortable in situations where you would defend yourself or defend your family, whether you're male or female, is an important thing. It's an important sense of yourself. And I think for me, the balance of it all, and you seem to really embody this also, in terms of education and compassion and humility, and pursuing arts, and and you mentioned the characteristics of being a fighter, and I think one of the greatest things when it comes to humility is really practicing your vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because something as teaching people, especially teaching people kickboxing, was people's expectations about what it means to get hit, and then their experience of being hit. And because it's going to happen. I mean, if you're in a combat situation, you will be hit, and there's fight, flight, or freeze, but there's also ways we can train ourselves to remain present in the moment and still be able to make conscious decisions. Even sometimes, like, and I've had this happen, like doing security and things like that I've done in the past, where been hit and then been able to make compassionate choices toward the person that was an aggressor.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I had the fortune while living in Washington to train at a very high level MMA gym for about 5 years, and at the time the UFC flyweight champion trained out of that gym, and he is still the champion. He's just in a different organization, but he is an incredibly humble guy, which was a real inspiration to see at a very personal level. But then also something that he talks about is, fighting on the biggest stage, and, especially in the social media era, where you're going to take losses eventually if you do it for long enough. But then also the kind of vulnerability of, being knocked out, especially in like a highlight finish. And then that gets shared over and over again for the week or weeks after that. And it's a really vulnerable situation to put yourself in, not just physically, but also emotionally. And it is something that, I don't think people realize maybe the gravity of that, but also the bravery that it requires to do something like that.
Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier about like that cult of personality idea in a couple different ways, and I think one of the things that fighting exposed me to was, and other things definitely exposed me to also, but was the value of not the concept of humility, but the practices of humility. And I started to look at things differently and saw that David, I never really met a truly humble person who was unhappy.
Yeah.
And from an existential level, just no matter what their circumstances were, when you're humble, you can find joy, you can find meaning in whatever's happening.
Yeah.
And that's cool. And that also, on the flip side, as far as like self accountability, like every time I would be in a bad mood, or someone would really upset me, I had to like take a step back and say, what role is my ego playing in this? And it was always a really significant role.
Yeah, and especially talking about men's issues and masculinity, the ego is the real killer. But also, I think, again, to reference social media, we live in a society that is very, the bigger the ego, the bigger the attention, or the bigger the following.
It's being rewarded. Yeah. I don't know what direction that goes. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's tough to know, and it's also something that I do spend a lot of time thinking about. And my hope is, I'm a big believer in the compounding effect of self-work, and not just how you then treat people after having done the self-work, having a positive network effect, but then also people being able to see the healing effect of doing that, and finding inspiration for their own work. And it's at whatever level that reaches, that is my hope with the podcast, to be able to share these stories and have these conversations and make people aware of how these things might be undermining their behavior or driving their behavior. But also, I think it would be itself egotistical to think that I can change that problem at a large scale.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think as far as the humility thing, a question that helped solidify the practice, for me was like, is it possible that the opposite of what I believe, maybe the exact opposite of what I believe to be true, is also a truth, and that's a lens that I look at social media through because there's people that know, and they're telling, and it's a truth, and I can't really identify with that. You and I talked before about you know uh, diagnoses and things like that, and I think that in mental health, diagnoses can be important to understand some of the treatments that may support that person, and it has to be navigated with compassion and care, because at the end of the day, we're responsible for non-malfeasance, like not injuring other people, and we don't know, so.
Yeah, and I mean, just broadly telling somebody you're a bad person, you need help, they're never going to take that offer up.
You're a bad person. I have people come to my practice and they'll say, I am bipolar or I am borderline personality, and I feel sad, and I feel a sense of compassion, and I feel a desire to partner with those people from a sense of equality.
Yeah, and then also just to go back to kind of like the very black and white or binary nature of things right now. It's very interesting for me as someone who did not grow up in this country, and this is true of a lot of Europe. The two-party system, it's very interesting to observe because it ends up being A or B, and every issue is every issue they just line up on either side, and there doesn't really seem to be any consistency in the morality of it. It's just you are, and a lot of these things are subjective, but people are saying objectively that's wrong, I'm right, A, B, etc. And it's really, I mean, at least to me, it is a real impediment to healthy discussion or kind of collaboration or just even just compassion to kind of like constantly be seeing the other side as wrong or the enemy, et cetera, et cetera. It feels like we're at a time right now where that is at its most prevalent, and it also, again, it's tough to know where that goes or how we get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I don't know, like the hallmark of emotional maturity is probably acceptance of like healthy ambivalence.
Yeah.
And that means that there's a lot of ands, and they're not buts, and they're, not points of exclusion. They're this also, and that also. And I think, as you were saying, that creates a lot more opportunity for, critical discourse. And we probably want to sprinkle in a little of that humility in there too, because I think it breaks down most when ego takes over,
Yeah, that ability to say, I have my beliefs, but I can also see your side.
Yeah, and even like, I know this is semantics, but and I can see your side,
Right. Yeah, I love that.
It's amazing. Like that is a practice. Just eliminating that word "but." It really has no purpose in our language, and using the word "and" instead. It seems like maybe trivial or cheesy or something, and yet it really metacognitively, it makes you begin to think about your thinking, and it begins to help you to embrace that reality of ambivalence. I think a lot of people are confused that ambivalence means that you're not able to make a decision,
Right.
Or you don't care, like indifference. And really it's the fact that sometimes I'll use the example of, I don't want to use her actual name, I was going to use my aunt's name. My aunt Marilyn, that's not her name. uh, during Thanksgiving. Like it wasn't Thanksgiving without Aunt Marilyn. And after she was there for an hour, like it was time for Aunt Marilyn to leave, So it's, I love you, and it's time for you to leave, And another example I think that people can probably relate to is, you and I talked about, I'm an avid motorcyclist, and if I get pulled over by a police officer, my first thoughts are, why aren't they arresting real criminals and all the other things that, we rationalize and justify in our minds. And then though, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and, my daughter is asleep in her bed and someone breaks into our house and I call them, they couldn't possibly get there fast enough, It's ands,
Yeah, and to kind of capture a different part of this, I did improv for a number of years, and one of the
Nice.
things that is central to improv is yes and
Yeah.
that had a really profound effect on my personal life, because I think my natural inclination before that was to push back or attack somebody's point of view, but instead of resisting somebody's energy, flowing with it.
Yeah.
And it actually did wonders for my social skills.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting that you say that, in that, I saw some couples on my caseload before I came here today. And by the time couples come to me in my private practice, there is an air of being adversaries,
Yeah.
And I think that, in some ways it's natural. Like conflict is really, imperative for intimacy, and yet when you get to that place of adversaries, then conflicts are defined by right or wrong. And, as you mentioned before, those dialectics don't work,
Yeah.
There's ands, there's spaces for compromise, and there's the difference between, being an adversary and being a partner.
Yeah.
Whether you're in politics or whether you're, in a fighting gym, or, yeah, there's just a real value in that intimacy,
Yeah. I did want to go back to fighting and fight gyms. At this time in California, you were still fighting, right?
By the way, improv is way scarier than fighting is, just for the listeners out there. Because my thing with fighting, it was being embarrassed. Like, that's my biggest fear, was being embarrassed physically. Like, I had been through the spine fusion and all that stuff. I wasn't worried about that. So yeah, improv sounds scary. And California, yeah, I picked up with Muay Thai almost exclusively, and then some jiu-jitsu later on.
I got you. And
decades of Muay Thai, though.
Yeah, for people who are not familiar, Muay Thai is pretty violent. It's pretty intense and pretty extreme. How did you balance your worldview of compassion and humility and all of the things in that spectrum with fighting?
Yeah, it's so interesting when you say that, in that, I think about like the Western concept of Muay Thai, or kickboxing. And then I think about the actual Thai fighters that I met, and they were the nicest, most humble.
That has also been my experience.
Beautiful people, and they were freaking lethal, I mean.
Oh yeah, absolute killers.
Training with them, their round kicks, would knock you on your ass when you're, excuse me for that, when you're trying to hold pads for them, and yet, they reach out and want to help you up. And so, I think there is, and we spoke about this off mic, that idea of like sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system,
Yeah.
And that, if you're reacting in a way that's emotional to what's happening, whether it be self-defense or fighting competitively, then you're at a severe disadvantage, not only psychologically, but in terms of, and we see this in UFC and MMA, the adrenaline dump and the cortisol and things like that have short-term and long-term implications to it if you do train regularly. So,
yeah.
So, just, being calm and being present, very much like, being a therapist, being aware of yourself in the world, and, having a degree of confidence and competency and ability that's also very much tempered with an understanding of your vulnerability and, humility. I think it kind of makes sense in that way.
I did actually just want to ask real quick, because I'm not as familiar with this. What are the long-term effects of like the cortisol dumps and stuff like that.
Oh man, everything and all this stuff changes constantly with science, and
Yeah.
understanding. So, but everything from people holding an unhealthy degree of body mass in terms of fat.
Right.
Cortisol causes that. The impacts of trauma. Uh, we've talked off mic about big T and little T trauma. The big T traumas being like situational or circumstantial traumas, like an assault or like natural disaster, car accident, things like that. And then small T traumas being more things like, family of origin issues, like being exposed to, you know, uh, fighting in the home, whether it's, arguing or physical fighting or toxic relationships or, you know, it, trauma is so subjective in
Yeah.
nature. Yeah, I think about, the examples of like people that get in an accident and they're both in the same car. They experience the same accident, maybe similar injuries, and one person never manifests,
Yeah.
the results of the trauma, and the other person has profound and debilitating, PTSD. And when you're in that cortisol response, thinking about like the vagus nerve and uh, the work like in The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've read
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Um, those are the result of those cortisol moments in our lives.
Yeah, it's fascinating what you mentioned about the car crash example. And my own version of this is I was already very, very interested in trauma for probably the last 20 years. And
Mm-hmm.
I only had my own realizations about my own trauma in the last 2 years or a little bit longer than that. But I had never connected the dots as to why I was so fascinated by trauma because I was too close to my own problems. But I have some version of something like survivor's guilt where I'm aware of the extreme effects that sexual abuse can have on people and
Yeah.
the places that leads to people to end up in. And, like it's something that I've thought about a lot of like, why did I have like a relatively normal and in a lot of ways, like very favorable or uh, I'm blanking on the word that like bountiful life. And some people end up in the streets, they end up at like in the sex industry, etc. And like
Right.
it
Or perpetrators.
right.
you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And like it is it's just fascinating to think about like how our minds work and how we react to trauma and all of the different factors that go into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, resilience is an amazing and very subjective and personal experience and phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had spoken about that. I interviewed my own therapist last week.
The tables turned, right?
Right.
Yeah.
She had also used that word resilience. And I had talked about having a very love-hate relationship with that word because to me, resilience was the ability to put myself in the meat grinder and just keep going and keep going. And like, especially as I worked through this stuff. And
Yeah.
I kind of think of Muhammad Ali in the later years. And, especially in that George Foreman fight, it was his ability to take punishment and then turn the tables once Foreman had exhausted himself. But then in his later years with the younger guys and his own physical abilities were failing, he was able to take a lot of punishment, but he paid for it both in the moment and then for the rest of his life after that. So being resilient in some ways can be a benefit, but also it can also hurt you in the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just, so many different forms of resilience and so many different definitions of resilience. I think it'd be really important in conversations like that to probably operationally define it so there's a common understanding between two people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, things that I've found that are interesting. You were mentioning like, the masculine experience, as an example, working with men and, the role that it plays to be able to differentiate thoughts from feelings and to be able to be aware of what you're feeling in a moment and to be able to express it in a healthy way. That has been like a revelation and a game changer in my life. It's really changed my outlook, changed my understanding of myself, and it's helped me be aware of you know that cliche of how we end up contributing to recreating our family of origin and our relationships. Yeah. So yeah, and it's such a simple formula. It's I saw nonviolent communication over there too. Rosenberg had something with that. And just that idea of men really being able to use I feel statements. And not I feel that you are doing this, or I feel that today's a sunny day or something like that. It's just using simple feeling words. I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel hurt, I feel scared, I feel excited, I feel hopeful, I feel joyful.
Yeah.
Being able to first know what you're feeling, and then to be able to share it with people in real time creates a degree of intimacy that stoicism does not allow.
Yeah.
And it's resilient, by
yeah.
the way. To tie it all back together, it's resilient.
Yeah, I was part of a men's group last year, and something that consistently came up that I found very eye-opening was the guy who facilitated the group was himself a therapist, and he would ask people like, how did that make you feel, or like, what were you feeling at that time? And the person answering would be like, well, this person did this, so then I did this, and that was really shitty that they did that, etc. And they would get it all out of the system, and then you'd say, well, you said all that, but I don't actually know how you felt about that. Like,
and what were you feeling?
Yeah, you never described what you felt, and I think that kind of speaks to people being disconnected from that.
Yeah, and I love what you said there too, and that there's like a little course correction, and that's a common thing too, is things that make us feel a certain way, and they don't. You mentioned like the cumulative impact of the cortisol experiences.
Yeah.
That stuff is stored also, and off mic we were talking about EMDR a little bit, and just the idea that it really is thought that the value in EMDR is adaptive information processing, and that idea that when the mind experiences trauma, it's like a bad librarian. There's information that we gather during the day, and then we have rapid eye movement, which is that bilateral stimulation. And through that, the brain takes things from short-term memory and it properly archives them into long-term memory. When there's a big T or a little T trauma, that's really disrupted. So experiences stay stuck nebulously in short-term memory. So, again, to go back to that cortisol question, these things are still subconsciously triggering us in the moment, such that we're not in the moment and we're reacting to traumatic experiences from the past. And when you combine that bilateral stimulation, whether it's using tapping or using eye movements, or in a clinical setting, and then processing some of those experiences, it does a nice job oftentimes of archiving them properly. The good librarian, right? Yeah, putting the book in the spot where you still know where that book is, where that memory is still, and it's not an impediment. It's not something you're going to trip over.
Right. Yeah, I did want to ask about your private practice. So wrapping up the California part of the story, you graduate and then straight into private practice?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And, I talked about the glass ceiling related to Cornell. And, I ended up getting very involved for years in leadership, and did a lot of leadership training and things like that, conducting leadership trainings. And then probably about a year ago, I realized that I never chose to be in leadership.
Yeah.
And it's not, this beautiful fairy tale that it chose me. I think, people that do well, and that's subjective and relative and everything like that. And when you do well, you get pushed up, especially in human services and nonprofit work.
Yeah.
And you're often pushed up without any real leadership training, so you can differentiate those roles. So I spent years and years and years in leadership and senior leadership and being a chief clinical officer for a couple large organizations. Um, and then I just realized that I don't like this.
Yeah.
I don't want to do this, you know?
Yeah.
I want to really just be able to, you know, do the best I can to help people and learn from people and, you know, connect with people. And if nothing else, be someone that they know really enjoys and cares about them. You know, I think that, you know, I thought about this years ago that, you know, we fundamentally have choices when we connect with someone, you know. We can reject them, we can tolerate them. And tolerance was a big thing in our country for a long time, you know. We can accept them, you know, and then there's even like that idea of radical acceptance. And then something that people don't talk about though is celebrating other people. And when you think about that idea of being, you know, like the men's work that we were talking about and being able to share feelings in real time, that's a huge part of, you know, expressing the vulnerability to really be able to celebrate others and to be celebrated yourself, you know?
Yeah.
And there's like a, you know, I kind of developed in my mind kind of like a sister continuum also with that one. And, you know, it's kind of the idea that there's like sympathy, you know? Well, there's apathy first, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
There's apathy, then sympathy, feeling sorry for. Then there's this idea of empathy, which I have to be honest, kind of drives me nuts because I think empathy is a great motivator and it's not a reality. Like, I will never understand you as much as we get to know each other, which I hope we're able to.
Yeah.
I'll never completely understand my wife and, you know, or anyone else, and probably not myself. Well, definitely not myself even, you know? And I think, you know, if you embrace that and you celebrate that, then it allows the opportunity, you know, to really practice kind curiosity, you know, and that's a huge part of mindfulness, you know,
Yeah.
is to remain kindly curious, no matter what's happening, you know?
Yeah, that's such an interesting concept. You know, as and again, it kind of speaks to that ego of how much we think we know ourselves, and
Yeah.
how
Can
little.
I piggyback on that really
Sure,
quick?
yeah,
Because the next step, which is an amazing segue from that idea of empathy, which, you know, I don't think is, you know, a destination to, you know, to seek is compassion.
yeah,
You know, I think that's where it really is at, is the idea of compassion for others. And, you know, the thing that ties in with what you're saying is self-compassion.
yeah,
And I run into a lot of clients and myself too. All this stuff definitely applies to me, you know, for sure. That they're able to, you know, share a definition, a working operational definition of what compassion means to them in the world. And then I'll ask them what self-compassion means. And then just complete confusion, you
yeah,
know? And I can relate to that, you know, for sure. And I think it, you know, it ebbs and flows, and it's a practice, you know, like given days currently as a therapist and, you know, as a man and experiencing the conditioning that I experienced when I was younger and, you know, the things I've chosen in my life, very importantly, you could ask me at any given time, what are you feeling right now? And I'd have to really search
yeah,
for what that is, you know?
yeah,
And that's, you know, someone that's really embraced this practice of it. And it's still that hard, you know?
yeah. So you had given us a primer on what EMDR, how it works.
Ish, you know, it's one of those things that are not sure exactly how it works, and it works. You know,
Yeah,
it's worked since the mid '80s. So.
yeah, it is something that I know a lot of people in my audience are curious about, but are not really sure what it is. So what does that actual experience look like if somebody were to engage in EMDR with a therapist?
Yeah, you know, I think it can look very different depending on the therapist and depending on the needs of the person that's in treatment. So, you know, it's definitely not a one size fits all kind of experience. And you know, there's many people that have much greater expertise in EMDR than I do, and so I can probably speak to what it looks like oftentimes with me.
Yeah,
You know, and that's that, you know, when we're working on things and, you know, people have goals and the goals are very personal to them, and we run into a barrier, you know, and it's kind of an invisible barrier. It means at that point kind of identifying maybe what some of the difficult feelings are, what some of the triggers are that they're noticing, currently. And from there, developing a picture of what those experiences, from the past or maybe the present looked like.
Yeah.
And then visiting that picture and then intermittently going from the picture to the bilateral stimulation. And then, asking the client, like, to, first it's, please take a full breath, breathing in on 4, breathing out on 6. And then what did you notice? And for the person participating in EMDR, which, by the way, for me was really difficult. I don't know if it was my ADHD or striving for some degree of perfectionism or being liked by the therapist. I wanted to be a good client.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah, so I tried to muscle the EMDR. And the interesting thing with EMDR is it's such a intimately passive experience in that you really are, you're a passenger on a moving train, and you're just looking out the window and you're noticing the landscape go by. So, after that full breath, it's, when you attempt to connect with the original image now, and there's usually a cognition that we attach, like first a negative cognition, then we'll install positive cognition. It's just, what did you notice?
Right.
And man, that's that spirit of kind curiosity right there, So it's the kind curiosity, and it's also tapping into the subconscious, through those eye movements, which, again, it's believed that those emulate the experience of, rapid eye movement sleep, and, that process's role in adaptive information processing.
Yeah. You had mentioned the term bilateral stimulation.
Yeah.
What forms can that take in EMDR?
Yeah. There's several different ones. I'm sure there's many now that I'm not aware of. The one that I'm kind of, I enjoy at this point because, it shows how old I am, is, being 25 and all, is, the Pong game from childhood.
Mm-hmm.
There's several apps now that you can use bilateral stimulation that way. And, some people respond to like more of a diagonal movement of their eyes, and some people respond more to a horizontal movement.
Interesting.
And that's just a matter of partnering and for the therapist to be present and to seek feedback, to ask those Socratic or open-ended questions, and to partner with the person.
Yeah.
Because it really is a therapeutic alliance. It's a collaborative partnership, therapy needs to be. So there's that one. There's the Pong method. And then there's like butterfly tapping, where you interlock your thumbs, and which is kind of nice too, because it's almost like cradling yourself.
Yeah.
And then you're tapping, and then, a tap on the left side means stimulation to the right side of my brain, and so forth. They just need to be alternating, And then there's the old fashioned, like tracking your hand, as the therapist moves their hand. And then there's also like mechanical devices for, tapping, and which, just means you would hold the devices in your hand, and then they'd send out a pulse from one side to the other. And then, there's kind of a spin-off to EMDR now. Probably some people will be turned off from me using the word spin-off of that, but, so many things in psychology are borrowed, orientation-wise from each other, and they're kind of grown that way or evolved that way, is brain spotting. And are you familiar with that one, David? So I'm definitely, again, not an expert in brain spotting. And the gist of it is, again, I bring it up because of that idea of the eye movements and, the therapist being present and mindful, during the session and what's happening. So, when you're doing the eye movement and you see like a, meta communication, you see a bodily reaction from the client in a certain position of that eye movement, is to stop right there and to process with the eye in that position, because we're finding that there's probably a direct correlation between the positioning of the eye and where consciousness is accessing in the brain, what area of the brain.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so you can stay there and people can remember things or experience things that are otherwise not really accessible to them.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Are there particular forms of trauma that are treated effectively by EMDR?
Yeah, many would say most types of traumas. I would say, the real limitation, coming back to that idea of like non-malfeasance, definitely not injuring the person. Have to be really careful with people that, one thing physiologically is eye movements. If someone is prone to migraines, you don't want to do that with them. And then other things, would include like dissociation. If someone has a tendency to dissociate, So you'll want to, assess, predispositions to dissociation prior to using EMDR. And, oftentimes we begin EMDR with a safe place protocol. So that really is just creating a safe place in their mind and then installing or enhancing that using the bilateral stimulation. And it also gives the therapist a chance to assess like how the client is responding to that process. And, some people respond great to it. And for other people, it's uncomfortable. And for other people, they start to experience like a flood of emotions, and that's when you pause and you go into a different type of grounding technique,
Yeah.
Uh,
In terms of your work with men and men's issues, we have already talked about healthy anger and working with the ego and things of that nature. What are some of the other common issues that men suffer that are maybe not common to both sexes?
yeah, we could probably segue back to the anger for
Yeah.
that one, and I think, that's the idea of, and again, this is changing, and I realize I'm a dinosaur in this respect, but I think it is still relevant for some people related to gender expectations for men, is that idea of the expectation of stoicism or, not being as overt with your expression of emotions, probably not being as honest with your expression of emotions, which does over time cumulatively lead to a degree of internal disconnect and dissociation from emotions also.
Yeah.
And to double back to the anger thing, and anger is so fascinating. It's like it seems to be meant, um, in an evolutionary sense as a survival trait, a survival reaction, to being physically threatened in some way,
Yeah.
and yet, you know, we get angry for so many different things. And something that I've found is, beginning to share those I feel statements, like with my wife and, people that worked for me or people that I worked for, because people learn a lot more from what we model than what we try to teach them,
Yeah.
It just really started to show me that, you know, wow, my first thought was anger because somatically that's what I believe I'm noticing. And there's such a disconnect with it to begin with that after, exploring it for, some months or years, that maybe I'm actually feeling frustrated because I don't have control of what's happening.
Yeah.
And, I like to think of emotions and working with men with emotions almost like the Russian dolls, You open up one and there's another one inside and you open that up. And most times, once we start really using this practice, and this really relates to that idea of like humility and vulnerability also because, and intimacy, because we get to that place where, wow, what I was really feeling was fear or
Yeah.
what I was really feeling was hurt, I mean, how many times do you feel like it's reasonable to tell your boss, I feel hurt, that this happened.
Yeah.
And I practiced that. And I mentioned leadership training and working with people at high levels of organizations. And man, for as simple as the idea of I feel statements is, and basically what I'm asking people to, inviting them to consider is like the value of applying emotional intelligence to leadership, and yet it just didn't stick, it just didn't stick. And, and think about it. I mean, and a term I would use that would make, those people in the trainings really uncomfortable was like organizational intimacy. And we spend so much of our time in our jobs, those are intimate relationships, And if you think about it, like, HR or performance, attendance, and conduct issues, uh, they're not issues about thinking and perception. They're issues because people start to act out, what they're not expressing,
Yeah.
and, just if there's a place to like hold for difficult emotions, in the workplace, you develop much more effective teams.
Yeah. It's funny because a large part of my professional experience was at Microsoft, and two books that you have referenced throughout this conversation, Nonviolent Communication and Radical Candor,
Yeah.
were two mainstays on people's bookshelves in Microsoft, and people really preached the merits of these frameworks. But
Did they practice it though?
no, that
Yeah.
was the thing.
Gosh.
It was like, hey, we're all about this, but the actual lived experience was not at all reinforcing of those values.
There's an orientation called motivational interviewing that really develops some of those concepts, like from nonviolent communication, which was formerly assertive communication. And we used to teach that to organizations. And, when I'd first come in, they'd say, oh yeah, we do motivational interviewing. It's an evidence-based practice and everyone uses it, and theoretically, yes, conceptually, maybe some understanding. And then I would read the progress notes. And, the best way to understand a culture is its vernacular,
Yeah.
and missing in the vernacular were the terms that are evident, in motivational interviewing, which is using ands and not using things like whys and shoulds, and asking what or how questions, open-ended questions, using, reflection, direct reflection and paraphrasing,
Yeah.
And again, the concepts are not difficult. For some reason, it translating to action or practice seems to be more difficult. Maybe it's that ego thing.
Yeah. Going back to anger, you had mentioned the words fear and violence, but the word that I'm really glad that you used was control. And when I think of anger, I think there's two different sides to control. There is using anger to control people, as a form of intimidation or just bullying them into getting them to do what you want. But then also there is anger as a way of regaining control, and that being an expression of somebody feeling powerless in that moment.
Brilliant. And in that context, that is where maybe partnering with people to re-operationally define anger as being a threat to your physical person, rather than the example that you just gave, which is a really common one, which is manipulation. It's about attempting to control other people. That's not a genuine sense of anger. And the person that's perpetrating that is going to experience over time cumulative negative consequences for that behavior also. So I see many of those people in counseling also,
Yeah.
And it's not that there are those people, because we do both, in terms of honoring actual anger and experiencing the vulnerability of hurt and fear, as well as at times using our anger to try to control circumstances also,
Yeah. What does healthy anger look like?
Wow. How long was the podcast again? First off, is it possible that the exact opposite of what I believe to be true is also a truth? I don't know, David. And I would say from my experience, and something that, has worked in partnering with people from a place of humility and openness to their ideas and their experiences, that, again, anger is when we're being threatened, physically in some way. And it can be emotionally also, and it leads us to fight or flight. It leads us to, either run away or stay and fight, or, I think boundaries is another one we could have many episodes on. I think that's probably the greatest source of, my job security as a therapist, is that idea of phenomenologically where one person begins and another person ends. We struggle with that through our whole lives, different seasons, for different reasons. So yeah, I think, and then probably the important thing is expressing it, and being able to tell people, when it's safe, obviously,
Yeah.
if, someone has a gun to my head, it's going to be different anger than, if my wife agrees to come home at a certain time and she doesn't call me, which would never happen because my wife is so angelic. And, in case she listens to this, no, she's wonderful. Yeah, and still though, like I said, there's been times with my wife where, not having that relationship with my anger, I've said, I feel angry, and then just something doesn't quite sit congruently with that, you know? And because my body is telling me I'm angry, I have the pit in my stomach, and I have the shakiness in my hands, and the adrenaline is flowing. And, and what if that's fear though,
Yeah.
And with my wife, it was fear. It was, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, which again, now we're back into those kind of family of origin
Right.
wounds.
And recreating that trauma.
Yeah, where EMDR really can help out and cognitive processing therapy and brain spotting and somatic experiencing,
Yeah. You have referenced humility and your humility practice several times throughout this conversation. Where did that start, and what benefits has that had for you? And then also, like, if somebody is interested in cultivating their own humility practice, where should they start with that?
I think where it began with me was adversity building character, like kind of almost forcing you to develop character, from an existential perspective. Um, and then I think, all altruism aside is just noticing again that idea that I've never really met or experienced a truly humble person that was unhappy.
Right.
So seeking my own happiness, and, happiness, I believe is a state and it's a practice. And then joy is more something that we attain that becomes an integral part of who we are,
Yeah.
Yeah. I again, I'm sorry about the semantic thing that should,
Yeah.
I worry
Right.
about because
Sure.
then I'm prescribing to people and I don't know what's best for anyone. I barely know what's best for myself.
Where
And
can they start?
yeah, thank you so much for saving me on that one. Yeah, I think, beginning with that idea of, asking yourself when you have a really strong opinion on something, when asking yourself, is it possible that the opposite of what I believe to be true is also a truth?
Yeah.
Um, I've found value in these things. I don't know if that'd be valuable to other people or not. You know, uh, Instead of offering people, an opinion, ask an open-ended question, ask a what or a how question,
Yeah.
and then really listen. Uh, it's amazing. I think about, the idea of listening and then, another great one, related to humility is apologies. I mean, I would invite people to go out and be a student of adult apologies. I'm sorry. It's just that I'm sorry, but we're all prone to that.
Yeah.
There's an apology, and then there's a rationalization or a justification for the behavior that harmed someone else.
Yeah.
Whereas if we get to the vulnerability and we're not guarding ourselves, we're willing to be intimate, is to say, man, I'm so sorry I hurt you, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. To kind of speak to, or to maybe frame something that you've said a different way. You talked about you don't know any truly humble person who is unhappy. I also I don't know if anybody has ever said that person has too much humility or that person has too much compassion, at least not expressed in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like even if you are hesitant to say somebody might experience benefit from doing this, it seems unlikely that it would have a negative effect on someone's life.
Yeah. I mean, you really facilitate a meaningful conversation. You really do. And
Thank you.
I think, a lot of times meaningful conversations come full circle. And, I think about that idea of what got me into fighting,
Yeah.
as someone that is pretty calm and pretty compassionate and loving by nature. And, I think it was the idea of like, man, is it a reality that kindness will be mistaken for weakness?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think, that's where humility gets confusing for people. And then we're back to the boundaries thing, though.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I can
was
be
gonna bring
humble
that up. Yeah.
and still have strong boundaries,
Yeah.
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 And
I
that
think
takes a lot to develop, though.
yeah, it gets lost a lot in that conversation for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, we are at time,
Nice.
but I think this has been a beautiful, wonderful conversation that I think people will get a lot out of. So I wanted to say again, thank you for showing up today and for sharing so much of your story and so many of your insights with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Could I offer a gratitude also?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Man, I find you to be like really intriguing, kind, humble person with some really unique experiences and perspectives on those experiences. And just, your openness to vulnerability is nothing short of courageous.
Thank you very much.
And really enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm really grateful we were able to connect.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Scott.
Yeah. Thank you.